John Foreman, a figure intimately familiar with the inner workings of Russia's military apparatus, offers a unique perspective on the conflict in Ukraine. Having served as the UK's defense attaché in Moscow from 2019 to 2022, and previously in Kyiv, Foreman gained first-hand insight into the strategic preparations of both nations. In a recent interview with The Economist, he meticulously dissects why Russia's anticipated swift and overwhelming victory never materialized. His account reveals a critical juncture where, seated across from Russia's defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, and Chief of the General Staff Valery Gerasimov, Foreman made a final, desperate plea. He urged them to reconsider their impending invasion, stating, "More and more evidence was building that Russia was going to invade. So this was really much the last-ditch attempt to deter them from doing so." His objective was not merely to engage in diplomatic pleasantries, but to challenge their talking points, to delve into the substantive realities, and to articulate the dire consequences of an invasion for Europe, Ukraine, and Russia itself. He emphasized the potential for bilateral and multilateral efforts to stabilize relations, should they choose a path other than aggression. As history now records, these warnings went unheeded. Following that pivotal meeting, President Putin issued the order to invade, setting in motion a chain of events that would redefine geopolitical landscapes. While the world watched with bated breath, largely expecting Russia to swiftly crush its adversary and annex vast swathes of Ukrainian territory within days, Foreman harbored a different conviction. His insider knowledge of Russia's military readiness led him to describe the situation as an omni-shambles, a chaotic disarray that fundamentally undermined their operational capabilities. He proceeded to outline several key factors that contributed to Russia's profound miscalculation and subsequent failure. In the intricate dance of warfare, few errors are as catastrophic as underestimating one's opponent. Even when a numerically superior and ostensibly more powerful force confronts a seemingly weaker one, a fundamental respect for the adversary is paramount. To approach conflict with an assumption of effortless victory, believing the enemy will simply capitulate, is a recipe for disaster. History is replete with examples where battles and even entire wars were won by forces initially perceived as inferior. This is because warfare transcends mere numerical superiority. It is not simply a matter of who possesses more soldiers and tanks. Instead, it is an infinitely complex interplay of myriad variables, each influencing the ultimate outcome. Despite this historical precedent, Russia, along with many international observers, fell into the trap of underestimating Ukraine. Russia, steeped in its own grand military history and its status as a global military superpower, viewed Ukraine through a lens of condescension. It saw a nation poorer, weaker, and significantly smaller, Russia being approximately 28 times larger. This perception led to a dangerous dismissal of Ukraine as a major threat and a disbelief that Kyiv could mount a credible defense against Russian ambitions. The Russian leadership failed to comprehend the depth of determination, defiance, and outright rejection of Russian rule that would galvanize the Ukrainian military and its civilian population. Many global commentators shared this initial assessment, anticipating a swifter, albeit bloody Russian triumph, convinced that Ukraine lacked the wherewithal to contend with the might of the Russian Federation. This underestimation extended beyond Ukraine itself, encompassing its allies. When the invasion commenced, Putin issued stark warnings of consequences you have never seen to any nations contemplating interference. This was likely intended to deter Western intervention. It failed. Instead, the Western world, alongside countries from other regions, rallied unequivocally around Ukraine, providing unprecedented levels of financial, humanitarian, and military aid. This collective support transformed Ukraine into a far more formidable challenge than Putin, or any other Russian official, had ever envisioned. Russia's strategic blunders were compounded by a profound overestimation of its own military capabilities. Undeniably, Russia commands a massive military force, consistently ranking among the top 3 globally, often alongside or even surpassing China, though trailing the United States. Historically, its military has been a source of fear, renowned for its immense armored divisions, vast artillery stockpiles, seemingly inexhaustible troop reserves, and formidable naval and aerial assets. Furthermore, Russia possesses the world's largest nuclear arsenal, with nearly 5,500 warheads, exceeding that of the United States and far surpassing all other nuclear powers combined. This makes Russia a nation that no country would willingly engage in direct conflict, given its capacity for inflicting immense damage and catastrophic loss of life. The ongoing conflict in Ukraine has tragically demonstrated this destructive potential, with hundreds of thousands of casualties, including tens of thousands of Ukrainian civilians. However, Russia's strength and extensive resources do not render it unbeatable or infallible. Even the United States, a military power far exceeding Russia in almost every metric, is not an unstoppable, invulnerable force. No military is. Every armed force possesses inherent weaknesses and can be severely challenged by a well-organized and strategically astute opponent. Yet Russia appeared to disregard this fundamental truth. As Foreman succinctly observes, did they underestimate the Ukrainians? Yes. Did they overestimate themselves? Yes. Russia entered this war with a pervasive sense of preordained victory, convinced that its overwhelming advantages in manpower, equipment, and other domains made defeat an impossibility. This leads directly to Foreman's third critical observation. At the core of Russia's self-overestimation lay a deep-seated arrogance. Since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Russia has struggled to reconcile itself with the independence of its former constituent republics. It continues to perceive itself as the de facto regional hegemon, extending its influence into nations like Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. President Putin, in particular, openly laments the collapse of the Soviet Union, famously declaring in a 2005 address that its demise was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century, a genuine tragedy for the Russian people, leaving tens of millions of our fellow citizens and countrymen beyond the fringes of Russian territory. Numerous experts interpret this sentiment as indicative of Putin's ultimate ambition: to reconstruct the Soviet Union, at least in some form, with Ukraine representing a crucial piece of this geopolitical puzzle. For years, Putin has propagated the narrative that Ukraine, despite its distinct national identity, remains an integral part of Russia. Foreman notes that Putin and other high-ranking Russian officials have historically viewed Ukrainians as inherently weaker and inferior, often referring to them disparagingly as Malorossia or Little Russians. This condescending perspective, rooted in a belief in Russian superiority, fostered a dangerous hubris. The sentiment was, in essence, we are the great Russian people, they are the small Russian people. We are the heirs of Zhukov, they are just a bunch of, quote-unquote, country bumpkins who are corrupt and inefficient and can't run their own country. Thus, Russia embarked on the war not only with a strong sense of entitlement, but also with deeply ingrained sentiments of xenophobia and chauvinism, which profoundly influenced the strategic decisions made by Putin and his generals. These feelings, as Foreman suggests, effectively blinded the leadership, preventing a rational and level-headed assessment of the situation. Russia's arrogance and fundamental misunderstanding of Ukrainian identity and societal realities led to a set of expectations that were wildly detached from reality. Indeed, at the outset of the war, reports emerged indicating that Putin and other Kremlin officials anticipated a swift conclusion, believing the conflict would be over within days. Some Russian soldiers were even reportedly instructed to pack parade uniforms, envisioning a triumphant march through the streets of Kyiv. This delusion was corroborated by Russian military figures themselves. Vladimir Churkin, former head of the Russian ground forces, candidly remarked in a recent interview, "Everyone, as you remember, started saying on February 24th that the war would end in 3 days. We'll finish them all off right away. I would give all of Russia's intelligence services a poor rating. I would say that the state authorities essentially received false information that 70% of the Ukrainian population was on our side and 30% against. It turned out to be exactly the opposite. What did that lead to? We already know. Literally within the first week, we learned a cruel lesson. Many Russian soldiers, upon entering Ukraine, genuinely expected to be greeted as heroes and liberators. They anticipated a populace eager to embrace them, grateful for deliverance from a tyrannical oppression that, in reality, did not exist. Instead of flowers and cheers, they encountered bullets and bombs. This profound disconnect between expectation and reality is inextricably linked to Russia's other strategic failures. The unrealistic expectations fueled an unwarranted arrogance and confidence, preventing any accurate foresight of the formidable resistance awaiting them across the international border. A significant contributor to Russia's wildly unrealistic expectations was the profound failures within its intelligence services, particularly the Federal Security Service, FSB, the modern successor to the Soviet KGB. Despite its formidable reputation as one of the world's most powerful intelligence agencies, the FSB catastrophically misjudged the situation in Ukraine. According to various reports, some FSB agents were so convinced of a smooth Russian invasion that they were already actively selecting safe houses and accommodations for the new pro-Russian government they intended to install. Foreman elaborates on this mindset. "We've already done all this work, and then the whole country is going to collapse. The leadership will flee. We'll surround the army of Donbas, force them to surrender, bring on a puppet leader, sort of a Lukashenko-type figure, eradicate the Ukrainian intellectuals and those people that would get in the way and then move on." In essence, Russian intelligence officials were operating with a premature sense of triumph, assuming their plan was flawless, and that the reintegration of Little Russia into its big brother was merely a matter of time. Furthermore, even if some FSB agents harbored doubts or concerns about the operation, Foreman highlights a critical systemic flaw. Negative intelligence was not effectively communicated up the chain of command. There were problems in the intelligence preparation, especially the intelligence services passing information up that Putin wanted to hear. In other words, the FSB prioritized delivering palatable information to Putin, avoiding any intelligence that might contradict his preconceived notions or desired outcomes. This likely played a pivotal role in Putin's decision to authorize the invasion. While he might have proceeded regardless of the intelligence, a more accurate and comprehensive briefing could have prompted greater restraint or a more meticulous planning process for his special military operation. Even with the aforementioned systemic issues, Russia might still have achieved a swift and decisive victory in Ukraine had it executed a well-conceived and tactically sound plan. However, this was not the case. An invasion of such magnitude demands unparalleled preparation and flawless execution. Even minor mistakes or oversights can cascade into significant problems, and Russia made numerous critical errors in preparing its forces and launching the initial assault. Foreman points out, "I thought also in the execution, the fact that they had 4 parallel thrusts into Ukraine at the same time. No overall commander, no logistics, no rehearsals, as I said." This lack of centralized command, inadequate logistical support, and absence of proper rehearsals were glaring deficiencies. In the early days of the invasion, the disorganization was painfully evident. An official 2022 report from the European Council on Foreign Relations noted that Russian forces abandoned many vehicles and other equipment due to a lack of supplies, effectively handing over expensive tanks and armored vehicles to Ukraine due to Russia's profound mismanagement of resources. Many units were unable to reach their objectives due to fuel shortages or other logistical failures. Ukrainian forces, recognizing these vulnerabilities, actively exploited them, disrupting Russian supply lines and ammunition depots wherever possible, while Russia attempted to consolidate its forces in eastern Ukraine to shorten front lines and supply routes. This strategy inadvertently presented Ukraine with a more concentrated target, making it easier to identify and neutralize critical logistical infrastructure. John Foreman's overarching assessment of Russia's readiness in February 2022 points to a pervasive and systemic incompetence. He highlights instances where maps and operational plans were outdated by the time the invasion order was given, concluding, "I think it's just catastrophic failure of the Russian state. I think it's a symbol of how much Russia's institutions, like the army, armed forces, Ministry of Defense, have been eaten away by corruption and incompetence." The trajectory of the war has served as a damning indictment of these very institutions. The Russian army, once revered for its imposing and intimidating reputation, famed globally for its seemingly unparalleled strength and solidity, has delivered a performance marked by profound disappointment. While Russian forces continue to make incremental gains in Ukraine, these advances come at an excruciatingly slow pace and at an extraordinary cost in terms of casualties for minimal returns. A recent report from the United Kingdom's Ministry of Defence reveals staggering figures. Russia has likely sustained approximately 140,000 casualties, killed and wounded, since launching its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, including approximately 353,000 casualties in the conflict so far in 2025. Independent experts and open-source intelligence analysts corroborate colossal losses of Russian military equipment, with tens of thousands of tanks, armored vehicles, radars, air defense systems, artillery, and other assets obliterated by Ukrainian weaponry. Beyond the battlefield, Russia has faced unprecedented international isolation. Its banks and businesses have been severed from global trade, its citizens restricted from entering various countries, and its international relationships and reputation fractured for generations to come. The Russian economy, too, is spiraling into increasing depths of chaos, marked by plummeting oil sales, historic lows in exports, and a dwindling pool of international partners willing to engage in business with Moscow. With each passing day, Russia incurs a greater price for the recklessness, arrogance, and incompetence of its leadership. This tragic outcome, Foreman suggests, might have been averted had those same leaders heeded the voices of reason during his meeting with them and other British military officials in 2022, before the conflict began. Further insights into the internal criticisms within the Russian military, such as those voiced by General Vladimir Churkin, offer additional perspectives on the Kremlin's strategic missteps. The stark contrast between Russia's astonishing losses and its meager territorial gains underscores the profound wastefulness of the war. For those seeking more in-depth analysis of military news, insights, and breakdowns, dedicated channels continue to provide comprehensive coverage of this evolving conflict. To elaborate further on the pervasive incompetence, the Russian military's logistical failures were not merely isolated incidents, but symptomatic of a deeply ingrained corruption and a lack of modern operational planning. The reliance on outdated maps and the absence of a unified command structure for multiple thrusts into Ukraine speak volumes about a military establishment that had become ossified and complacent. The expectation that local populations would welcome them as liberators, rather than resist fiercely, highlights a profound disconnect from reality, fostered by a system that prioritized favorable reporting over accurate intelligence. This systemic failure extended to the maintenance and readiness of their equipment. Reports of vehicles breaking down due to poor upkeep, or being abandoned due to lack of fuel and spare parts, painted a picture of an army ill-prepared for a sustained, high-intensity conflict. The initial rapid advances, often cited as evidence of Russian military prowess, quickly stalled as supply lines became overstretched and vulnerable to Ukrainian interdiction. The inability to adapt to these challenges, to secure supply routes, or to effectively coordinate combined arms operations demonstrated a critical deficiency in modern military doctrine and practice. The human cost of this incompetence is immeasurable, not only in the lives lost and wounded, but also in the long-term psychological impact on the surviving personnel and the erosion of morale across the ranks. The initial belief in a swift, decisive victory quickly gave way to a grinding war of attrition, for which the Russian military was demonstrably unprepared. This unpreparedness was not just a matter of equipment or numbers, but a fundamental flaw in strategic thinking and operational execution, rooted in the very institutional weaknesses that Foreman so acutely observed. The consequences of these failures will undoubtedly resonate through Russian military doctrine and strategic planning for decades to come, forcing a painful re-evaluation of their capabilities and their place on the global stage. The war in Ukraine has thus become a crucible, exposing the vulnerabilities of a military that, despite its formidable appearance, was ultimately undermined by its own internal failings and a profound misjudgment of its adversary. Furthermore, the psychological dimension of the conflict cannot be overstated. The Russian military leadership, blinded by its own propaganda and a distorted view of Ukrainian national identity, failed to anticipate the fierce and unified resistance it would encounter. This miscalculation had a cascading effect on troop morale. Soldiers who expected a welcoming reception instead faced hostile populations and determined defenders. The initial shock of this reality, coupled with severe logistical shortcomings and the relentless pressure of combat, quickly eroded their fighting spirit. The narrative of a special military operation designed to liberate Ukraine from Nazis crumbled in the face of widespread Ukrainian patriotism and a clear desire for self-determination. This ideological failure contributed significantly to the disarray and lack of cohesion observed in Russian units. The inability to articulate a clear, compelling, and truthful purpose for the invasion undermined the very foundation of military discipline and motivation. When soldiers do not understand or believe in the cause they are fighting for, their effectiveness is severely compromised. This was exacerbated by the intelligence failures, where negative reports were suppressed, creating a false sense of security and preparedness at the highest levels of command. The disconnect between the Kremlin's narrative and the reality on the ground created a chasm that Russian forces struggled, and ultimately failed, to bridge. The long-term implications of this psychological and ideological defeat are profound, affecting not only the current conflict, but also the future recruitment, training, and overall cohesion of the Russian armed forces. The war has exposed not just tactical and logistical weaknesses, but a fundamental vulnerability in the ideological underpinnings of the Russian state's military projection. This deep-seated issue, far more complex than mere equipment shortages or poor planning, will require a generational effort to address, if it can be addressed at all, and stands as a testament to the comprehensive nature of Russia's strategic miscalculations.